The first time my father called me the dropout in front of 14 people, he didn't even look at me when he said it. He just lifted his wine glass, smiled at his guests, and said it like a casual fact, like something everyone at that table had already agreed was true. And I remember staring at the reflection of the chandelier in my water glass, counting the lights because it was easier than reacting, easier than correcting him, easier than reminding everyone that I had actually left for a reason they never bothered to ask about. But that night wasn't special, it wasn't even the worst one, it was just the first time I realized that in this family, my name had been replaced by a label. And once a label sticks, it spreads, it becomes shorthand, it becomes identity, it becomes who you are. Every time someone new walks through the door, my name is Emily Carter, I'm 29 years old, and for the last 6 years, I haven't been introduced as a daughter or a sister or even a person. Just the dropout, said with a half laugh, said with a shrug, said like a warning, like a disclaimer before anyone accidentally took me seriously. And the thing about repetition is it changes the room. It changes how people look at you before you even speak. At Thanksgiving, my father carved the turkey and said, "Emily tried college once," and everyone chuckled like it was part of the script. At my cousin's engagement dinner, my mother leaned into a woman I'd never met and whispered, "She's still figuring things out." And I could feel the shift immediately, the polite smile, the quick nod, the subtle way conversations moved around me instead of including me. And then there was Sophie, my younger sister, 2 years behind me but somehow always 10 steps ahead in their eyes. Stanford, honors, consulting job lined up before graduation. The kind of life my parents could display, the kind of story they could repeat proudly. "This is Sophie," my father would say, voice lifting, posture straightening. "She just signed with a firm in San Francisco." And then a beat, always a beat, just long enough to turn toward me. "And this is Emily." Pause, small smile, our dropout. And every time I told myself it didn't matter, that I was past needing their approval, that I had my own life, my own work, my own plans that didn't require their understanding. But the truth is, something happens when you hear the same word enough times. It starts to echo even when the room is quiet. It follows you home, it sits with you at night, it shows up in the way you introduce yourself to strangers, in the way you hesitate before answering simple questions like, "What do you do?" And I learned to keep my answers short, vague, safe. "I do some freelance work. I'm exploring a few things," never specific, never detailed, because specifics invite questions and questions lead back to the same place, the same judgment, the same label I could never quite outrun. Except there was one person at those dinners who never laughed, never repeated it, never even used the word. My Uncle David, my father's younger brother, quiet, observant, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He would sit at the far end of the table, scrolling through his phone occasionally, not disengaged, just watching. And sometimes when my father made one of his comments, I'd catch my uncle glancing up just for a second, like he was measuring something, like he was noticing details no one else cared to see. But he never defended me, never interrupted, never corrected the narrative. And for a long time I thought that meant he agreed with them. That silence was just another form of judgment, until last Sunday. The night everything shifted, the night the word dropout hung in the air one more time, heavier than usual, sharper than usual. And for the first time in 6 years someone didn't laugh, because that was the moment my uncle's phone lit up, and the look on his face changed everything. But I didn't realize that yet, not in that second, not when I was still staring at my plate, still bracing for the next joke. Still believing this dinner would end the same way all the others had. I didn't realize that the label they had repeated for years was about to collide with something they couldn't explain, something they couldn't dismiss, something that would force them to see me differently whether they wanted to or not. And I definitely didn't realize that this was the last night anyone in that room would ever call me the dropout again. I noticed the silence before I saw anything. That was the first thing. Not the phone, not the screen, just the silence, because in my family silence never happens unless something has gone wrong. My father was mid-sentence, smiling, explaining to one of Sophie's colleagues how success was all about discipline and follow-through. And then he glanced toward my uncle, expecting the usual nod, the usual quiet agreement, but it did not come. Instead, Uncle David was staring at his phone like he had just read something that did not belong in that room, his thumb hovering, not scrolling, not typing, just frozen. And for a second nobody else noticed. The clinking of silverware continued. My mother reached for the salt. Sophie laughed at something someone said about San Francisco rent prices. And I almost missed it too. I almost stayed in my own little bubble of practiced indifference. But then my uncle did something he never did. He looked up directly at me, not past me, not through me, directly at me, and there was something in his expression I could not place at first. Not pity, not surprise, something sharper, something closer to recognition. Like he had just connected two pieces of information that were not supposed to fit together. And then he looked back down at his phone, tapped the screen once and exhaled slowly. That was when my father noticed. "Everything okay, David?" he asked, still half smiling, still holding his wine glass midair like the conversation had only paused for a breath. My uncle did not answer right away. He tilted the phone slightly, not enough for anyone else to see, just enough to read whatever was on it again. And then he set it face down on the table right next to his plate, deliberate, controlled, and said, "Yeah, just work." But his voice was off, not loud, not dramatic, just different, like he was choosing each word carefully, and I felt something shift in my chest, a small, almost invisible crack in the version of reality I had been living in for years, because nothing in my family ever interrupted the script, and this felt like an interruption, a small one but real. My father nodded, satisfied, already moving on. "Where was I?" he said, turning back to his guest. "Right, discipline, that is what separates people who succeed from people who—" He paused just long enough to glance at me again, the familiar smirk returning. "Well, people who do not finish what they start." A few quiet chuckles, a polite smile from the guest. Sophie lowering her eyes for a second, like she always did when things got uncomfortable, and I felt the word forming before he even said it, like a reflex, like a habit he did not have to think about anymore. "Our dropout," he added, almost casually, and this time the word did not land the same way, not because he said it differently, but because of what had happened seconds before, because of that look on my uncle's face, because of that brief moment where something did not fit, and I found myself glancing down the table just for a second, just to see if I had imagined it, but my uncle was not looking at his phone anymore. He was looking at my father, not smiling, not reacting, just watching, and it was subtle, so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. But I had spent 6 years studying every shift in that room, every tone, every glance, every micro-expression that told me how I was being perceived, and this was new, this was different, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I had trained myself not to feel. Not hope exactly, something quieter, something more cautious, like the beginning of a question I was not ready to ask yet, because I still did not know what was on that screen. I did not know why it mattered. I did not know why my uncle, the one person who had always stayed neutral, suddenly seemed alert, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something had just entered that room that did not belong to the story my parents had been telling about me, and whatever it was, it had my uncle's full attention, and that alone was enough to make me realize, maybe for the first time, that the version of me they had been repeating at every dinner might not be the only version that existed anymore, even if they did not know it yet, even if I did not fully understand it yet, because whatever had just lit up on that phone, it was not random, and I had the strange, unsettling feeling that it was connected to me in a way none of them were prepared for. The rest of that dinner should have unfolded exactly like every other one, polite conversation, controlled laughter, my father steering every topic back to achievement and status, my mother reinforcing it with quiet nods, Sophie playing her part perfectly, and me sitting there, present but irrelevant. But something had shifted and I could not unfeel it. I could not go back to ignoring the small details, because now I was watching my uncle the same way he had been watching me for years, and once you start noticing, you cannot stop. He barely touched his food. He did not check his phone again, but his hand stayed close to it, like it mattered, like it might matter again at any second. And every time my father spoke, every time that familiar tone of casual judgment slipped into his voice, my uncle's expression tightened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to catch, but enough for me, and it made me realize something I had never considered before. Maybe he had always seen more than he said. Maybe silence had not meant agreement, maybe it had meant he was waiting, but waiting for what? That was the question that started forming in the back of my mind, slow and persistent, because nothing in my life happened without context, not really. Everything traced back to one decision, one moment 6 years ago that had been simplified into a single word: dropout, as if that word explained everything, as if it erased everything that came before it. I was 21 when I left second semester business program, decent grades, nothing spectacular but nothing failing either. I remember sitting in a lecture hall that smelled faintly like coffee and dry erase markers, staring at a slide about market segmentation while my phone buzzed in my pocket, one message after another, all from the same email thread I had almost ignored, and that was the thing no one in my family ever understood. They thought I woke up one day and quit, like it was impulsive, like it was laziness, but I had not quit. I had chosen something else, something I did not know how to explain to people who only valued paths they recognized, and when I tried the first time, my father did not even let me finish. "So you are throwing away your degree?" he said, leaning back in his chair like the conversation was already over. My mother asked how I planned to support myself. Sophie looked at me like I had just made a mistake she could never afford to make, and I realized in that moment that the details did not matter, the explanation did not matter. They had already decided what it meant, And once they decided, there was no room left for anything else, so I stopped explaining. I packed my things. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment 40 minutes away, 600 square feet, second floor. The kind of place where the heating clicked on and off loud enough to wake you up at night. And I started building something I could not describe to them without it sounding like nothing. Long hours, inconsistent income, learning everything as I went, failing quietly, adjusting, trying again. And for a while I thought maybe they were right, maybe I had made a mistake, because progress does not look impressive when it is still small, when it is still fragile, when it does not have a title or a salary you can announce at dinner. And that was when the label stuck, because it was easier for them, easier to reduce everything I was doing into something they understood or thought they did. Dropout. And over time I let the word sit there unchallenged. I let it define me in that room, because correcting it felt like trying to translate a language they had no interest in learning. But sitting there now, watching my uncle replaying that moment when his phone lit up, I felt something shift inside me again, because whatever had appeared on that screen, it had not surprised him completely, it had confirmed something. Something he had been watching, something he had been piecing together quietly while everyone else was too busy repeating the same story. And for the first time in 6 years I started to wonder if someone in that room actually knew what I had been doing all along. And more importantly, if they were about to say it out loud, because the way my uncle was looking at my father now, calm but steady, like he was waiting for the right moment, made it clear that this dinner was not going to end the way it always had, even if no one else at the table realized it yet, even if I was only beginning to understand it myself, because whatever had just entered this room through a simple notification, it was not just information, it was leverage. And I had the unsettling feeling that my entire identity in this family was about to be challenged by something none of them could dismiss as easily as they had dismissed me. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, and in my family, silence like that was not just rare, it was unnatural. It was the kind of silence that made people shift in their seats, adjust their posture, reach for their glasses even if they were not thirsty. And I could see it happening in real time, the discomfort spreading quietly around the table. My mother glancing at my father like she was waiting for him to regain control of the conversation. Sophie lowering her gaze to her plate, carefully cutting a piece of pie that she did not eat, and my father, for the first time that night, hesitating just for a fraction of a second before clearing his throat and forcing a small laugh. "Come on, David," he said, tone light but slightly tighter than before. "You know I am just teasing." And that was when my uncle did something that changed everything. He reached for his phone again, not quickly, not dramatically, just calmly, like he had already decided this moment was coming, and he turned the screen toward my father, not enough for the entire table to see, just enough for him, and I watched my father's expression shift in real time, the confidence fading first, then the smile, then something else, something closer to confusion, like he was reading a language he did not expect to see, and I felt my breath catch, not because I knew what was on that screen, but because I could see the effect it was having. And that effect did not match the story they had been telling about me for 6 years. My father leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing, scanning whatever was displayed, and then he blinked once, twice, like he needed a second to process it. "What is this?" he asked, voice lower now, no longer performing for the room, and my uncle did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone else to notice that something was happening, that something had broken the pattern, and then he said, "You tell me." Calm, steady, controlled, and that was when my mother leaned in slightly, curiosity overriding caution. "Richard?" she asked softly, but my father did not respond. He was still staring at the screen, still trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed, and I realized in that moment that whatever it was not small, it was not something he could dismiss with a joke or wave away with a comment. It was something concrete, something undeniable, something that carried weight in the exact language he understood, numbers, titles, recognition, the kind of proof he had always required but had never thought to look for in me. And I felt something inside me tighten, not fear exactly, but anticipation mixed with a strange kind of vulnerability, because for years I had controlled this part of my life by keeping it separate, by letting them believe what they wanted while I built something they were not invited to see. And now that separation was collapsing, not by my choice, not on my terms, but in the middle of a dinner table where I had spent years being reduced to a single word. And I did not know how much my uncle had revealed. I did not know what exactly was on that screen, but I knew it was enough to disrupt everything, because my father finally looked up slowly, like the act of lifting his head required more effort than it should have, and his eyes moved from my uncle to me, and for the first time in 6 years, he did not look at me with dismissal or amusement or mild disappointment. He looked at me like he was seeing a version of me that did not fit the one he had been repeating, like he was trying to adjust something in his mind and could not do it fast Enough, and the room felt smaller, suddenly tighter, like the air itself was waiting for the next word, the next reaction, the moment where everything would either snap back into place or break completely. And I sat there, hands resting quietly in my lap, heart steady but louder than it had been all night, realizing that whatever happened next, whatever my uncle chose to say or not say, the word they had used to define me was already starting to lose its grip. Not because I had argued against it, not because I had corrected them, but because something they trusted more than my voice had just contradicted it. And I did not realize then how much that would change, not just for them but for me, because that moment, that quiet shift in how they looked at me, was only the beginning of something much bigger than a single dinner, much bigger than a single label, something that had been building for years without their knowledge, and was now finally impossible for them to ignore. My father did not speak for what felt like an entire minute, and in that space, everything we had all accepted as normal started to feel fragile, like it had been held together by repetition alone and was now beginning to crack under the weight of something real. He looked back down at the phone again, as if hoping the screen would change, as if whatever he saw could somehow correct itself, but it did not, and I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, small signs that would have gone unnoticed any other night but were impossible to miss now. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked, his voice quieter, stripped of the usual confidence, and my uncle leaned back slightly in his chair, not defensive, not aggressive, just composed. "It was sent to me," he said, and that was all, no elaboration, no explanation, just enough to confirm that whatever this was, it had come from somewhere outside this room, somewhere my father could not control, and that was what made it dangerous. My mother shifted beside him, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. "What is it?" she asked, her tone careful, almost cautious, but my father did not answer her either. He was still looking at me now, not directly, not fully, but enough, like he was trying to connect the person sitting across from him with the information on that screen and finding the gap too wide to bridge. And I felt it too, that gap, that distance between the version of me they had reduced to a single word and the version that existed outside this house, the one they had never asked about, never wanted to understand, and for a second I considered speaking, explaining, filling in the silence with something that made sense, something that aligned the two realities, but I did not, because for the first time I realized I did not have to translate my life into something they would accept, because something else had already done it for me, something they trusted more than my voice, more than my explanation, more than anything I could say at this table, and that realization was both unsettling and strangely grounding at the same time, because it meant the control I had held so tightly for years, the control of keeping my world separate from theirs, was slipping, but it also meant that what I had built was strong enough to stand on its own, even in a room where I had been dismissed for so long. "Emily," my father said suddenly, and the sound of my name, just my name, without the label attached to it, without the dismissive tone that usually followed, caught me off guard more than anything else that had happened that night. I looked up, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since we sat down. And there was something there I had not seen before, not respect, not yet, but something closer to uncertainty, like he was no longer sure of the narrative he had been so confident in. "Is this accurate?" he asked, and the question itself felt foreign, like it did not belong in this house, like it had been pulled in from a completely different reality, and I held his gaze for a moment, long enough to let the weight of it settle, long enough to feel the shift in power that came from not rushing to answer, from not immediately filling the silence the way I used to, and then I said simply, "Yes," and that was all. No explanation, no details, just a single word that confirmed everything without giving anything away, and the effect was immediate. My father leaned back slightly, exhaling in a way that sounded almost like disbelief. My mother's hand moved to her glass, gripping it just a little tighter. Sophie's eyes flicked between us, trying to understand what she had missed, and my uncle, still calm, still composed, reached for his phone again, tapping the screen once before sliding it slightly across the table, not fully, not enough for everyone to see, but enough for the moment to move forward, enough for whatever was coming next to become inevitable. And I sat there steady, quiet, realizing that the story they had been telling about me for years was no longer the only story in the room, and more importantly, it was no longer the one with the most authority, because whatever was on that screen had already started to rewrite it, and for the first time I was not the one trying to be understood, they were the ones trying to catch up. The shift did not happen all at once, it was slower than that, more unsettling because of how quiet it was. My father did not explode, he did not laugh it off, he did not immediately try to regain control the way he usually would. Instead he just sat there, staring at the edge of the table for a moment like he was recalibrating something internal, Like he was trying to figure out how the version of me he had repeated for 6 years could exist at the same time as whatever was on that screen. And the longer he stayed silent, the more the rest of the table began to lean into that silence. My mother finally spoke again, softer this time. "Richard, what does it say?" And there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, not curiosity, not exactly, something closer to concern, because she could feel it too, that whatever this was, it was not small, and my father exhaled slowly, still not looking at her. "It says..." He paused, like even saying it out loud required a shift he was not ready for. "It says Emily is listed as a founding partner." And the words landed in the room like they did not belong there, like they had been dropped in from somewhere else entirely. And I saw it immediately, the confusion, the recalculation, Sophie's head lifting slightly, my mother's eyes flicking toward me and then back to my father, trying to process it in real time, and my father continued, his voice still measured, still controlled but no longer certain. "It is some kind of company profile, valuation numbers, press coverage," he added, almost reluctantly, like each detail pushed him further away from the narrative he had been holding on to, and I could feel every pair of eyes in that room shift toward me, not fully, not openly, but enough to change the weight of my presence at that table. And for a second I said nothing, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted them to sit with it, to feel that gap between what they thought they knew and what was now in front of them, because that gap was where everything had lived for years, unseen, unacknowledged, dismissed before it could even be explained, and now it was theirs to navigate, not mine. "Emily?" my mother said, a little more directly this time, and I turned to her, meeting her gaze calmly, and there it was again, that shift, not acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of something else, something that required her to look at me without the filter she had relied on for so long. And I could see the question forming behind her eyes, not just what is this, but how did we not know, how did we miss this entirely, and that was the part that lingered, not the information itself, but the realization that they had never actually looked, never actually asked, never actually considered that there might be more to me than the version they had settled on. And my uncle, still quiet, still composed, finally leaned forward slightly, just enough to bring the moment into focus. "It is not just a listing," he said, his tone even deliberate. "It is verified, multiple sources, interviews, financial disclosures." And my father's hand tightened slightly around his glass again, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief, like the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to throw off his balance. And I realized then that this was not just about me anymore, it was about them, about what they had chosen to believe, what they had repeated, what they had built their understanding of me around, and how easily it was now being undone by something they could not ignore, because it was written in the language they trusted, the language of numbers and recognition and external validation. And I sat there steady, watching it unfold, not stepping in, not correcting, not explaining, because for the first time I did not need to. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, as my father finally looked at me again, really looked at me, I realized something I had not expected. This was not the moment I had imagined, not the one where I proved them wrong, not the one where I explained everything and watched their reactions shift in real time. It was quieter than that, more controlled, more inevitable, like the truth had been building on its own timeline, independent of their perception, independent of their approval, and had now arrived without asking for permission. And the most unsettling part was not that they were seeing it. It was that they were realizing they had never tried to see it before, and that realization was only just beginning to take hold. No one reached for their food anymore, the plates sat half-finished, the pie untouched, glasses of wine forgotten mid-sip, and for the first time in years, I was not the one being quietly ignored at that table. I was the center of something none of them knew how to navigate. My father shifted in his chair again, slower this time, like every movement required thought. Like the certainty he used to carry so easily had been replaced by something heavier, something less stable. A founding partner. Of what exactly? He asked, and there was no sarcasm in his voice now, no performance, just a question that sounded almost careful. And I noticed everything now, the way his tone had changed, the way he was choosing his words instead of letting them fall automatically. And I could have answered him directly, I could have explained everything in a few sentences, the company, the growth, the past few years condensed into something neat and understandable, but I did not yet, because this moment was not about information, it was about realization, and that takes time. "It is called Northbridge Analytics," my uncle said instead, glancing briefly at me before continuing, not asking for permission but also not overstepping, just stating what was already there. "Data infrastructure, enterprise clients, mostly on the West Coast." And I saw it register, not fully, not all at once, but enough, my father nodding slightly like he recognized the structure of that explanation like it fit into a framework he understood, and then his eyes moved back to me again, sharper now, more focused. "And you are involved in this?" he asked, and the way he phrased it told me everything. He was still trying to scale it down, still trying to place it somewhere manageable, somewhere that would not require him to completely rebuild his understanding of me. And I felt something shift inside me again, not anger, not satisfaction, something steadier, something more grounded, because I had spent years trying to make myself understood in this room, and now I did not feel the need to rush it. "I started it," I said, my voice calm, even not louder than before, not softer, just clear, and the words settled into the silence in a way nothing else had that night, because they did not invite interpretation, they did not leave room for adjustment, they simply existed. And for a second, no one responded, not immediately, not with the quick reactions that usually filled every gap in conversation, just that same quiet tension, stretching a little longer now, deepening, becoming something undeniable. Sophie blinked, her fork pausing midair. My mother's lips parted slightly like she was about to speak but stopped herself, and my father leaned back again, this time not in control, not in confidence, but in something closer to processing, like he was stepping back mentally, trying to see the full picture instead of just the piece in front of him. "How long?" he asked after a moment, and that question more than anything else revealed the shift, because it assumed continuity, it assumed effort, it assumed time, things he had never connected to me before. "6 years, I said, and I watched it land, watched the timeline align in his mind, the same 6 years he had been repeating that word, the same 6 years he had been telling anyone who would listen that I had walked away from something, that I had stopped, that I had failed to follow through, and now those same 6 years existed in a completely different context, one he had not seen, one he had not asked about, one he had dismissed without ever looking, and I could see it, that realization, slow but undeniable, moving through him, reshaping something fundamental. And my uncle, still quiet, added just one more piece, not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough. "Valuation is public," he said. "Last round placed them at just under 80 million. And that was it, that was the moment the room fully shifted, because numbers like that do not exist in ambiguity, they do not invite dismissal, they do not allow for easy reinterpretation, they sit there solid, undeniable, in the exact language my father had always trusted. And I saw it in his eyes, the final piece clicking into place, not acceptance, not yet, but recognition, the kind that cannot be undone once it is seen. And for the first time in my life, the silence that followed did not belong to me, it belonged to them. And I realized, sitting there in that room that had defined me for so long, that the version of me they had repeated at every dinner had just been replaced by something they could not ignore, something they could not reduce, something that did not need their approval to exist. And that was the moment everything truly began to change, even if none of them knew what to do with it yet. No one spoke for several seconds after that number settled into the room, and this time it was different from before. This was not confusion anymore, this was recalibration. My father leaned back slowly, his fingers loosening around the glass like he had forgotten he was holding it, and for the first time in my life I watched him struggle to respond, not because he did not have something to say, but because nothing he had said for the past 6 years applied anymore. And that kind of silence is louder than any argument. My mother was the first to move, her voice softer now, more careful than I had ever heard it at this table. "Emily, why did you not tell us?" And the question hung there, fragile, almost sincere, but it carried something else underneath it, something that felt less like concern and more like confusion about how they had missed something so significant. And I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, I almost answered the way she expected, something simple, something that made it easier for everyone. But the truth was not simple, and it was not new, it had been there the entire time. "I tried," I said, and my voice did not rise, it did not break, it stayed steady, because this was not anger, this was clarity. "The first time I explained why I was leaving, you did not let me finish, and I let that sit there, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, just as a fact. And I saw it land, not dramatically, not with immediate reaction, but with that same slow shift that had been building all night, my mother's expression tightening slightly, my father's eyes narrowing just enough to indicate recognition, not of the event itself, but of the possibility that it had happened differently than he remembered. And Sophie shifted in her seat, her posture no longer confident, no longer relaxed, because for the first time, the balance in the room was not centered around her, it was shifting toward me in a way she could not control. And my father finally spoke again, but this time his tone was different, stripped down, direct. "You left without a plan," he said, and it sounded less like a statement and more like something he had been repeating to himself for years, something he needed to hold on to, and I nodded slightly, not agreeing but acknowledging the version he had chosen to believe. No, I said calmly. I left with a different plan. And again, I did not elaborate. I did not rush to explain the late nights, the early failures, the months where nothing worked, because that part of the story was not for this table, not in this moment. What mattered was the shift that was happening right now, the realization that their version of events had been incomplete, and more importantly, that they had never asked for the full picture. My uncle leaned back slightly, watching the exchange without interrupting, letting it unfold naturally, and I realized that was what he had been doing all along, not controlling the moment, just making sure it could not be ignored. And my father exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on me. 6 years, he repeated, quieter now, like he was saying it to himself as much as to anyone else, and there was something in that repetition that felt heavier than anything else that had been said, because it forced him to confront the gap, not just in information but in attention, in awareness, in the way he had chosen to see me. And I could see it now, clearly, the moment where the narrative he had built started to fracture, not collapse completely, not yet, but enough to let something else in. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to fill that space. I did not feel the need to guide them through it or make it easier, because this was not my realization to manage, it was theirs. And the room stayed quiet, not empty, but full of something new, something unresolved, something that could not be undone. And as I sat there, watching them process a version of me they had never allowed themselves to see, I realized that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something much more complicated, because recognition is only the first step. And what comes after that? What people choose to do with it, that is where everything really changes. And in that moment I could already feel that whatever came next, it would not go back to the way it had been, not after this, not after tonight, not after the truth had finally entered the room in a form they could not dismiss. The conversation did not recover after that. It shifted into something quieter, more deliberate, like everyone was choosing their words instead of letting them fall naturally. And that alone told me how much had changed. My father was no longer speaking to impress anyone at the table. He was thinking, calculating, trying to rebuild something he had taken for granted for years, and that process made him slower, less certain. Why did you not come to me? He asked finally, and there it was again, that subtle shift, not accusation, not quite, but something close to it, like he was trying to reposition himself inside a story that had already moved past him. And I felt the weight of that question, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer had always been there, unchanged, ignored. Because you already had your answer, I said, and I kept my tone even, not sharp, not defensive, just clear. And I watched it land, not dramatically, not with immediate reaction, but with that same slow recognition that had been building all night. My father's expression tightening slightly, his eyes holding mine a little longer than before, and I could see it, the moment he realized that what I said was not new, that it had been true for a long time, and that realization carried something heavier than anything else, because it was not about what I had done. It was about what he had not done, what he had not asked, what he had not allowed space for. And my mother shifted beside him again, her voice softer, more careful. We thought you. She stopped, like the sentence did not fit anymore, like whatever she had been about to say no longer aligned with what she now knew. And that hesitation said more than any explanation could have, because it revealed the gap, the assumption they had lived in for years without questioning it. And I realized something in that moment that I had not fully understood before. It was not just that they had misunderstood me, it was that they had never been curious enough to find out who I actually was. And that absence of curiosity had shaped everything, the way they spoke about me, the way they introduced me, the way they reduced 6 years of my life into a single word they could repeat without thinking. And now that word no longer worked. It did not fit the reality sitting in front of them, and they did not know what to replace it with. And that uncertainty filled the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a new presence that had not been invited but could not be ignored. Sophie finally spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. You built a company? And there was something in her tone that felt unfamiliar, not admiration, not exactly, but something closer to recalculation, like she was trying to place me in a new hierarchy, one that did not match the old one she had always relied on. And I nodded once, simple, direct, not expanding, not performing, and she leaned back slightly, processing, her usual confidence replaced by something more cautious, because the comparison she had always benefited from no longer worked the same way. And my father exhaled again, longer this time, his hand moving to his forehead briefly before dropping back to the table. 80 million, he repeated under his breath, not to anyone in particular, just to himself, like he was testing the number, seeing how it felt. And I understood that moment, because numbers like that force a kind of clarity. They strip away interpretation, they leave no room for dismissal, and in that clarity everything else has to adjust. And I could see it happening, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, the structure of how they saw me shifting in real time. Not because I had demanded it, not because I had explained it, but because something they trusted had confirmed it. And I sat there steady, watching it unfold, not rushing to fill the silence, not offering more than what was necessary, because this was not about proving anything anymore. It was about letting the truth exist without being filtered through their expectations. And as the room settled into that new reality, I realized something that surprised me. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel the rush of being proven right. What I felt was something quieter, something more grounded, like a weight I had been carrying without noticing had finally shifted. Not completely gone, but lighter. And that change did not come from their reaction. It came from the fact that for the first time, I was not being defined by what they chose to say about me. I was being seen through something they could not control, and that difference, that shift in where the authority came from, was what truly changed everything, even if they were only just beginning to understand it. It did not end with some dramatic apology or a sudden shift in tone. It ended the way real things usually do, quietly, with small changes that carried more weight than anything loud ever could. My father did not say he was wrong, not directly, not in a way that would give the moment a clean resolution. Instead, he sat there longer than usual, his posture slightly different, less rigid, less certain, like something inside him had been unsettled and had not yet found a new place to land. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured. "So what exactly do you do there?" And that question, simple as it was, carried more meaning than anything else he had said that night. Because it was the first time he had asked about me without attaching a judgment to it, without framing it as a failure or a comparison, just a question. And I noticed that immediately, the shift from assumption to inquiry, and I answered him the same way I had answered everything else that night, clearly. "Without performance, I lead product strategy," I said. "We build infrastructure that helps companies manage large-scale data systems." And I kept it at that, not simplifying it for him, not dressing it up, just stating it in the language I had lived in for the past 6 years. And he nodded slowly, not fully understanding, I could see that, but trying to, and that effort alone was something new. My mother leaned forward slightly, her expression softer now, almost searching. "And it is doing well?" she asked, and there was something careful in the way she phrased it, like she did not want to assume too much, like she was stepping into unfamiliar territory. And I nodded once. "Yes," I said, and again I left it there, because the details were not the point was that they were asking, that they were no longer relying on the version of me they had created without input. And Sophie sat quietly beside them, her usual ease gone, replaced by something more reflective, like she was reassessing the balance she had always relied on. And I could see it in the way she glanced at me, not dismissively, not casually, but with a kind of cautious attention that had never been there before. And my uncle, still quiet, finally leaned back in his chair, his role in the moment complete, not needing to say anything else, because he had already shifted the trajectory of the night with a single action. And I realized then that what he had done was not just reveal information, it was create space for a different version of me to exist in that room, one that could not be overridden by old assumptions. And that space changed everything, not instantly, not completely, but enough to alter the way they looked at me, the way they spoke, the way they chose their words. And my father picked up his glass again, taking a small sip, not to reset the conversation but to steady himself, and when he set it back down, he looked at me once more, longer this time, and there was something in that look that had not been there before, not pride, not yet, but something closer to recognition, like he was seeing me without the filter he had used for so long. And that shift, subtle as it was, carried more weight than anything he could have said, because it meant the narrative had changed, not completely, not cleanly, but enough to break the pattern. And as the dinner slowly resumed around us, conversations restarting in quieter tones, movements becoming more natural again, I realized that nothing about this night would be repeated the same way. Not the introductions, not the jokes, not the casual labels that had once defined me so easily, because once something is seen, truly seen, it cannot be unseen, and even if they tried to return to the old version, it would not fit anymore, it would feel off, incomplete. And I sat there, no longer shrinking into the background, no longer adjusting myself to match what they expected, just present, steady. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I had to prove anything, because the proof had already spoken, and what remained was not validation but something quieter, something more lasting, the shift in how I was perceived, and more importantly, the shift in how I chose to see myself in a room that had once reduced me to a single word. The dinner ended without any formal conclusion, no final statement, no clear resolution, just a slow unraveling of everything that had once felt fixed. Chairs pushed back more quietly than usual, plates left half cleared, conversations trailing off instead of wrapping up neatly, and I noticed the difference immediately because for years, these dinners followed a rhythm I could predict down to the exact moment I would be reduced to something smaller, something easier for them to manage, but tonight had broken that pattern. And once a pattern breaks, it does not reset. It lingers, it changes how every next moment unfolds. My mother stood by the kitchen counter, gathering plates but not moving with her usual efficiency, her mind clearly elsewhere. My father remained at the table longer than anyone else, his fingers resting lightly against the wood, not tapping, not fidgeting, just still, like he was holding on to the moment, trying to understand where exactly it had shifted beyond his control. And Sophie moved more quietly than I had ever seen her, her usual confidence replaced by something more internal, more reflective, like she was recalculating a balance she had never questioned before. And I stood near the doorway for a moment, watching it all from a distance that felt new, not separate in the way I had been before, but not fully inside it either, like I was no longer defined by the space yet still aware of its influence. And then my mother approached me, not quickly, not with urgency, just slowly, carefully. "Emily," she said, and there was a softness in her voice I had not heard directed at me in years. We did not know. And I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second I saw something different, not just confusion but something closer to regret, not fully formed, not fully acknowledged, but present enough to be felt, and I considered what to say, because this was the moment where things could either become something else or fall back into something familiar. And I realized something in that second. I was not interested in rewriting the past for them. I was not interested in making it easier for them to understand, because understanding requires effort, it requires attention, and that had been missing for a long time. "You did not ask?" I said gently, not harsh, not accusing, just clear, and she nodded slightly, not arguing, not correcting, just accepting the truth of that statement in a way she had not before. And that acceptance, quiet as it was, mattered more than anything louder ever could, because it meant something had shifted internally, not just externally. And my father stood up then, walking toward us slowly, his expression still measured, still processing, and he stopped a few feet away, not too close, not distant either, just enough to hold the space between us. "We should have paid more attention," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried weight because they did not try to undo anything, they did not try to justify, they just acknowledged a gap that had existed for years. And I felt that land differently than everything else that had been said that night, not as closure, not as resolution, but as recognition, and recognition, even delayed, even incomplete, changes things because it creates the possibility of something different moving forward. And I nodded once, not accepting or rejecting, just acknowledging that the moment existed, that it had been said, and that it mattered in its own quiet way. And as I stepped outside a few minutes later, the night air cooler than expected, the sound of the door closing behind me softer than I remembered, I realized that nothing about this had unfolded the way I used to imagine it would. There was no dramatic reveal, no immediate reversal, no moment where everything snapped into place. Instead there was something slower, something more real, a shift in perception, a fracture in an old narrative, the beginning of something that would take time to fully change. And as I walked to my car, keys in hand, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, I felt something settle inside me, not triumph, not relief, something steadier, something quieter, like a foundation that had always been there but no longer needed to be hidden, because the version of me that had existed outside that house for 6 years had finally stepped into it. Not by force, not by explanation, but simply by being undeniable, and that, more than anything else, was what changed everything. The next morning did not feel like a continuation of the night before. It felt like a quiet reset, not of what had happened, but of how everything would be approached from that point forward. My phone lit up around 9:30 while I was standing in my kitchen, sunlight coming through the window in a way that made everything look calmer than it actually was. And for a second I just stared at the screen, because the name that appeared there had not shown up in that way for a long time. My father, not a missed call, not a forwarded message, but a direct call, and that alone told me something had shifted beyond that dining table. I let it ring once more before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to meet the moment the same way I had met everything else the night before, steady, controlled. "Emily," he said, and again just my name, no label, no hesitation, and there was a pause after it, like he was choosing what came next carefully. I have been thinking about. Last night, he continued, his tone measured, quieter than usual, and I leaned slightly against the counter, listening, not interrupting, not filling the silence because for once, he was the one stepping into unfamiliar ground. I did not know, he said, and this time the words carried more weight, not as an excuse, but as a recognition of something he could no longer ignore, and I let that sit there, because I had already said what needed to be said. I had already made it clear that the absence of knowledge had not been accidental, and he seemed to understand that now because he did not try to argue it, did not try to reshape it. Instead he continued, I should have asked. And that was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from him, not direct, not dramatic, but real enough to matter, and I felt that, not as validation but as a shift, a real one, something that would not have happened without everything that led up to it. You built something, he added after a moment, and there was a slight change in his tone there, something closer to acknowledgement than anything else, and I nodded even though he could not see it. I did, I said simply, and the conversation paused again, not awkward, not strained, just quiet, like both of us were adjusting to a version of each other we had not interacted with before. I would like to understand it, he said finally, and that sentence, more than anything else, marked the difference between what had been and what could be, because it was not about approval, it was not about judgment, it was about willingness, and willingness had been missing for a long time, and I considered that for a second, not rushing to accept, not pushing it away either, just recognizing it for what it was, a shift that had taken years to reach this point, and I answered the same way I had answered everything else, steady, direct, then ask, and there was a small pause on the other end, followed by a quiet exhale, like he understood what that meant, not just the words but the weight behind them, and we ended the call shortly after that, not with resolution, not with a clear next step, but with something that had not existed before, a space where something different could happen. And as I set my phone down and looked out the window again, I realized that the most important part of everything that had happened was not the number, not the company, not even the shift at the dinner table. It was this moment where the narrative had finally broken enough to allow something new to take its place. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change the direction of everything that came next, because for years I had been reacting to a version of myself that was handed to me without choice. And now, for the first time, that version no longer had control, and what replaced it was not just recognition from them, it was clarity from me, clarity about who I was, what I had built, and more importantly, what I no longer needed from them in order to feel certain about it. And that was the part they did not see, the part that mattered most. Because even if nothing else had changed, even if they had stayed exactly the same, I would not have gone back to that version of myself, the one that accepted being reduced to something smaller, because that version had already been left behind long before that dinner, long before that phone lit up, long before they ever realized there was more to me than the word they had repeated for years, and that realization, quiet as it was what truly changed everything.